In 43 years of emergency medicine, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had seen everything, until she saw William Harrison's back. The coffee cup slipped from her trembling fingers, ceramic shattering against the linoleum floor as she stared at the impossible sight before her. It wasn't just an infection, it was alive. The elderly veteran's wife, Dorothy, let out a strangled sob and stumbled backward into the curtain rail. The metal crashed to the floor, sending privacy drapes billowing like ghosts around the examination room. A younger man, their son, gripped the door frame, his army fatigues wrinkled from the desperate midnight drive to Cedar Falls Memorial. Dorothy's wedding ring caught the harsh fluorescent light as her hand flew to her mouth, remembering how she'd kissed those same shoulders goodnight for 47 years, never knowing what was growing beneath the skin, never suspecting the secret her husband had been carrying. Get Dr. Patterson down here now! Sarah barked into her radio, her voice cracking with urgency. What had they been living with, and how long did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Cedar Falls, Iowa had always been the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business and Sunday dinners lasted until dark. Population 8,400, nestled between cornfields and the Cedar River, it was a town where handshakes still meant something and a man's word was his bond. The Harrison family had called Maple Street home for 47 years, in a modest two-story house with white picket fence that William had painted every spring without fail. William Bill Harrison, 67 years old, stood 6 feet tall with shoulders that had carried railroad ties for 30 years and the weight of family responsibility even longer. His weathered hands told stories of honest work, calloused palms from the Burlington Northern Railway, gentle fingers that had braided his daughter's hair decades ago, steady grip that had held his wife through every storm life had thrown their way. Vietnam had taken 2 years of his youth, but it had given him perspective that money couldn't buy. "We didn't fight for glory," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "We fought to come home." Dorothy Dot Harrison moved through their kitchen with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 40 years healing others. At 64, she still wore her graying hair in the same neat bun she'd favored during her nursing career at Cedar Falls Memorial. Her gentle blue eyes had seen countless emergencies, held dying hands, and whispered comfort to frightened families. But retirement hadn't slowed her down. She volunteered at the church food pantry, organized the annual Veterans Barbecue, and somehow always knew exactly when a neighbor needed a casserole and a listening ear. Their son Michael had been their miracle baby, born when Dot was 35 and they'd given up hope of having children. 29 years old now, he stood as tall as his father with the same stubborn jaw and kind heart. Army Ranger training had added muscle to his frame and shadows to his eyes that hadn't been there before Afghanistan. 18 months overseas had changed him in ways the family was still learning to navigate. He'd moved back into his childhood bedroom after discharge, sleeping in the basement temporarily, while he figured out his next step. The Harrison house sat on a corner lot where Maple Street met Fifth Avenue, with a front porch that had witnessed decades of conversations, arguments, and reconciliations. Bill's railroad pension of $1,847 monthly, combined with Dot's nursing retirement of $1,200, kept them comfortable but not wealthy. They'd always lived within their means, paid their bills on time, and helped others when they could. The mortgage would be paid off next month, their final payment due December 15, 2023, a date circled in red on Dot's kitchen calendar. Medical bills from Michael's deployment had been mounting, $23,000 in outstanding charges for treatments the Army hospital couldn't provide, but they were Harrison's, and Harrison's took care of their own. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, family came first. Always family first. That November morning, as autumn painted the maple trees gold and red, None of them knew how severely that loyalty would be tested. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, November 15th, when William Harrison couldn't sit still during his morning coffee. Dot watched from the kitchen sink as her husband of 47 years shifted uncomfortably in his usual chair, the one with the faded blue cushion she'd sewn back in 1982. His weathered fingers kept reaching behind his back, scratching through his flannel shirt with increasing urgency. "Just dry skin, darling," Bill muttered when he caught her staring. "November air's getting to me. Always does this time of year." He forced a smile and took another sip of coffee. But Dot noticed the slight tremor in his hand, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. Michael sat across from his father, picking at his scrambled eggs with mechanical precision. The young veteran had been unusually quiet since coming home, spending most of his time in the basement bedroom, emerging only for meals and brief conversations about the weather or the Iowa Hawkeyes football season. But this morning, Dot caught him watching his father with an intensity that made her nurse's instincts prickle. "Dad, you sure you're okay?" Michael asked, his voice carrying an odd note of concern that seemed disproportionate to simple dry skin. "Course I'm okay," Bill snapped, more harshly than necessary. "Been dealing with worse than itchy skin since before you were born, son." The scratching continued throughout breakfast, growing more violent with each passing minute. Bill's fingers clawed at his back through the thick flannel, leaving red marks on his neck where his nails caught skin. When he stood to refill his coffee mug, Dot saw him wince, a quick, sharp intake of breath that he tried to hide behind a cough. "William, let me take a look at that," Dot said, setting down her dish towel. "I've been dealing with skin conditions for 40 years. Probably just need some lotion or—" "I said it's fine, Dorothy." Bill's voice carried a finality that surprised her. In all their years of marriage, he'd never refused her medical attention. When he'd had pneumonia in '98, when he'd sliced his hand open fixing the fence, when he'd thrown out his back moving furniture, he'd always trusted her judgment. Some things are better left alone. After breakfast, Bill disappeared into the garage, claiming he needed to winterize the lawn mower. But Dot found herself drawn to the kitchen window, watching as her husband paced back and forth between his workbench and the old Chevy, occasionally stopping to claw frantically at his back. Once, she saw him remove his shirt entirely, reaching over his shoulder in what looked like desperation. By afternoon, the scratching had torn through his shirt. Dot discovered the damaged flannel in the laundry basket, 3 long rips across the back panel, stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. When she confronted Bill about it, he claimed he'd caught it on a nail in the garage. "That's the 3rd shirt this week," she said, holding up the ruined fabric. "William, this isn't normal. Something's wrong." "Nothing's wrong that won't fix itself," Bill replied, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "Just need to be more careful around the workbench." Michael appeared in the doorway during their conversation, still wearing yesterday's clothes, dark circles under his eyes suggesting another sleepless night. "Maybe Dad should see Dr. Patterson," he suggested quietly, "just to be safe." "Absolutely not," Bill said with such vehemence that both Dot and Michael stepped back. "I'm not running to doctors every time I get a little scratch. We've got better things to spend money on than some fancy specialist telling me to use moisturizer." That evening, Dot found Bill in the bathroom, door locked, water running in the sink. She could hear him grunting with effort, occasional sharp intakes of breath that sounded like pain. When she knocked, he called out that he was fine, just washing up for dinner. But when he emerged 20 minutes later, his face was pale and sweaty, his shirt clinging to his back with what she suspected was more than just bathroom humidity. The breaking point came at 2:17 a.m. when Dot woke to find Bill's side of the bed empty. She discovered him in the living room, sitting forward on the couch, clawing at his back with both hands. His undershirt was soaked with blood, and in the dim light from the street lamp she could see dark stains spreading across the fabric. "William," she gasped, rushing to turn on the lamp. "Dear God, what have you done to yourself?" But Bill just looked at her with eyes full of something she'd never seen before, not just pain, but fear. Deep, terrifying fear that made her 40 years of nursing experience feel suddenly inadequate. "Dot," he whispered, his voice breaking like a man confessing his sins. "I think I'm in trouble." The morning of November 20th started like any other Tuesday, with the smell of coffee brewing and the gentle hum of the old refrigerator that Bill kept promising to replace. Dot had been awake since 5 a.m., unable to sleep after finding her husband pacing the hallway at midnight, his shirt damp with perspiration, and something else she didn't want to identify. 5 days had passed since that frightening scene in the living room, and despite her pleading, Bill refused to seek medical attention. "A man doesn't run to doctors every time he gets uncomfortable," he'd said, using that stubborn tone she'd learned to recognize over 47 years of marriage. "My grandfather lived to 92 without setting foot in a hospital except to be born and to die. Good enough for him, good enough for me." But as Dot poured his morning coffee, she noticed Bill's hands shaking worse than usual. The tremor that had started as barely perceptible now caused the ceramic mug to rattle against the saucer. His face had taken on a grayish pallor that reminded her of patients she'd seen in the cardiac unit, and when he attempted to sit in his regular chair, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone in significant pain. "William, your fever's back," she said, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead before he could protest. The heat radiating from his skin made her stomach clench with professional alarm. "This is 103 degrees minimum. We're going to the emergency room." "Like hell we are." Bill's voice carried more force than his weakened condition should have allowed. "I've had worse fevers in Vietnam. This is nothing a little rest won't cure." Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the same army t-shirt he'd slept in, his dark hair disheveled and worry etched across his young face. Over the past week, Dot had noticed her son watching his father with an intensity that seemed excessive for simple parental concern. There was something almost guilty in Michael's expression, as if he knew more about Bill's condition than he was admitting. "Dad, maybe Mom's right," Michael said carefully, pouring himself coffee with movements that seemed deliberately casual. "You don't look so good." "I don't need medical opinions from someone who's barely been home a month," Bill snapped, then immediately looked stricken by his harsh words. "Sorry, son, I'm just tired." That's when it happened. Bill attempted to stand from his chair, probably intending to apologize properly to Michael, when his legs simply gave out. He collapsed forward, catching himself on the kitchen table, but not before Dot heard the wet, tearing sound of fabric ripping across his back. The white undershirt he wore beneath his flannel split open like tissue paper, revealing something that made her 40 years of medical training feel utterly inadequate. "Dear God in heaven," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Bill's back was covered with wounds, not scratches or sores, but perfect circular openings in his flesh, each about the size of a quarter, arranged in no pattern she could understand. They weren't bleeding exactly, but each hole seemed to contain something thick and yellowish, and as she watched in horror, one of the wounds seemed to move. "William, what is this?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "What's happening to you?" Bill tried to straighten up, his face contorting with pain and something that looked like shame. "It's not what you think, Dot. I can explain." "Explain what?" "Explain how my husband has holes in his back." "Explain why you've been lying to me for weeks?" Her voice rose with each word, 47 years of trust cracking like ice in spring. "I'm a nurse, William. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Michael moved closer, and Dot saw something in her son's expression that chilled her more than the sight of her husband's ravaged back. Recognition. Michael wasn't shocked or confused. He was looking at those wounds like he'd seen them before. "Michael," she said slowly, her nursing instincts putting pieces together in ways she didn't want to accept. "What do you know about this?" "Mom, Michael started, then stopped, looking between his parents with obvious anguish. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" Dot's voice cracked. "Your father has parasites living in his back, and you think it's complicated?" The word parasites hung in the kitchen air like a curse. Bill closed his eyes as if she'd struck him, while Michael went very still in that particular way he'd learned in the army when situations became dangerous. "That's what these are, aren't they?" Dot continued, her medical knowledge filling in blanks she desperately didn't want to understand. Some kind of larval infestation, but how? Where? When? Bill sank back into his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him all at once. When he looked up at his wife, his eyes held the defeated expression of a man whose last secret had been exposed. "Vietnam," he said quietly. "Old exposure finally catching up with me. Doctor said it might happen, back in '73. Sometimes these things lie dormant for decades." But even as he spoke, Dot's trained eye caught the lie. These weren't old wounds reactivating. The tissue around each opening was fresh, irritated, recently formed, and Michael's reaction suggested this had nothing to do with Vietnam. "Don't lie to me anymore, William," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd used in hospital corridors when patients' lives hung in the balance. "Tell me the truth, or I'm calling Dr. Patterson right now." Bill looked at Michael, some wordless communication passing between father and son that excluded her completely. It was a look that spoke of shared secrets and desperate measures, of sacrifices made in darkness that had finally been dragged into light. "The truth," Bill said finally, his voice barely audible, "is going to break your heart, Dorothy. And once you know it, there's no going back." Dorothy Harrison had faced medical emergencies for 4 decades, but nothing had prepared her for the choice now confronting her in her own kitchen. Her husband sat slumped in his chair, 47 mysterious wounds visible through his torn shirt, while their son Michael stood frozen by the doorway with guilt written across his face like a confession. The morning sun streaming through her yellow curtains seemed to mock the darkness that had invaded their home. "I need the whole truth," she said, her voice carrying the steel she'd developed during night shifts in the ICU. "Right now, both of you." Bill looked at Michael with eyes that held a lifetime of paternal protection. "Son, maybe you should go upstairs while your mother and I—" "No." Dot's word cut through the air with surgical precision. "Whatever this is, it involves all of us. Michael, sit down." When her son hesitated, she used the tone that had commanded respect from interns and attending physicians alike. "Now." Michael reluctantly took his seat at the kitchen table, the same oak surface where they'd shared thousands of family meals, homework sessions, and heart-to-heart conversations. But this morning felt different, charged with the electricity that comes before devastating storms. "Mom," Michael began, his voice cracking like it had when he was 12 and confessing to breaking Mrs. Chen's window. "Dad's telling the truth about Vietnam, but not the way you think." Bill reached across the table and gripped his son's wrist. "Michael, don't. She deserves to know." Michael pulled away from his father's grasp, standing abruptly and beginning to pace the small kitchen. "We can't keep lying to her. Look at you, Dad. Look what this is doing to you." Dot felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her 2 men engage in some silent battle of wills. 40 years of nursing had taught her to read body language, and everything about this scene screamed of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. "I found some old military medical records," Bill said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Classified stuff about experimental treatments for soldiers exposed to biological agents in Southeast Asia. There was a doctor in Saigon, Dr. Hendricks, who was working on something called transfer therapy. Michael stopped pacing and leaned against the kitchen counter, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. "Dad, please don't do this." "Transfer therapy for what?" Dot asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would destroy everything she thought she knew about her family. Bill's eyes filled with tears she hadn't seen since the day they'd buried his father. "For removing parasitic infections from one person and transferring them to a volunteer host." The theory was that older, stronger immune systems could handle the burden better than young soldiers whose bodies were already compromised by combat stress. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of morning traffic. Dot felt the world tilt sideways as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. "You didn't get infected in Vietnam," she said slowly, looking at her husband with new eyes. "You volunteered to take someone else's infection." "Mom, no," Michael said desperately. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Dot's voice was deadly calm in the way that terrified her family more than shouting ever could. She turned to face her son, this young man she'd raised and loved and worried about through 18 months of deployment. "You're the one who came back infected. These parasites, they're yours." Michael's face crumpled like a man whose last defense had been stripped away. "I tried to handle it myself. I researched everything, ordered medications online, tried every treatment protocol I could find, but they weren't responding to conventional therapy, and I was afraid if the Army found out." "You were afraid they'd discharge you dishonorably," Dot finished, pieces of a horrific puzzle clicking into place. "So you told your father." "I never asked him to do this." Michael's voice broke completely. "I came home to figure out how to deal with it privately. But Dad found my medical supplies in the basement, made me explain everything. Next thing I knew, he was talking about this experimental transfer procedure he'd read about." Bill struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but determined to defend his actions. "The boy's got his whole life ahead of him, Dorothy. His career, his future, everything he worked for. What kind of father would I be if I let some foreign bugs destroy all that?" "What kind of father?" Dot repeated, her voice rising with each word. "The kind who lies to his wife for weeks while letting parasites eat him alive? The kind who risks his life on some insane medical experiment from 50 years ago?" "It worked," Bill said stubbornly. "The transfer protocol worked. Michael's been clean for 2 weeks now." "Clean?" Dot stared at her husband in disbelief. "William, you have 47 active parasitic infections. You're running a fever of 103 degrees. This isn't working, it's killing you." Michael buried his face in his hands. "I told him it was too dangerous. I begged him not to try it. But he'd already started the procedure by the time I realized what he was doing." "Procedure?" Dot's medical mind recoiled at the implications. "What exactly did you do?" Bill's silence stretched until Michael answered for him. "He sedated the larvae with topical anesthetic, then used surgical tweezers to transfer them from my back to his. 17 separate sessions over 2 weeks. Dad insisted on taking all of them." The room spun around Dot as the full horror of what her husband had endured became clear. 17 sessions of self-inflicted medical torture performed in secret while she slept upstairs, believing her family was healing from the wounds of war. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel. "You did surgery on yourselves," she whispered, "in our basement, without proper equipment, without sterile conditions, without any medical supervision." "I sterilized everything," Bill said defensively. "Used your old nursing supplies, followed protocols from the medical journals Michael found online." "My supplies?" Dot felt hysteria bubbling up in her chest. "You used my medical supplies to perform experimental parasite transfers?" "Mom, please." Michael stepped forward, hands raised as if approaching a wild animal. "We were desperate. I couldn't risk a medical discharge and Dad couldn't stand watching me suffer. So instead, I get to watch both of you suffer." Dot exploded, 47 years of suppressed anger and fear pouring out at once. Do you have any idea what you've done? Those parasites could kill your father. They could spread to other organs, cause sepsis, organ failure. I know the risks, Bill interrupted quietly. I accepted them the day I became a father. The simple dignity in his voice stopped Dot's tirade cold. She looked at this man she'd loved since she was 17 years old, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, the stubborn protector who would literally take his son's burdens onto his own flesh, the soldier who'd never truly left the battlefield where men sacrificed themselves for their brothers. "The medications aren't working, are they?" she asked, her professional assessment overriding her emotional turmoil. Michael shook his head miserably. The larvae are more aggressive in Dad's system. Maybe because of his age, maybe because of the transfer trauma. They're growing faster, reproducing more rapidly than they did in me. Which means? Dot asked, though she already knew the answer. Which means, Bill said with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used to explain household repairs and lawn care, that I need proper medical attention. Soon. Dot sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her family had attempted. Two men she loved beyond measure had risked everything to protect each other, and in doing so had created a medical crisis that could destroy them all. "We have to call Dr. Patterson," she said finally. "This is beyond anything we can handle at home." "No hospitals," Bill said immediately. "If this gets out, Michael's military record—" "Forget his military record," Dot snapped. "I'm trying to save your life. My life isn't worth his future." "Yes, it is." The words tore from her throat with such force that both men stepped back. "Your life is worth everything to me, William Harrison. Everything. And if you think I'm going to sit here and watch you die from some misguided sense of noble sacrifice, you don't know me at all." She stood up, reaching for the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. "I'm calling Emily Patterson right now. She specializes in infectious diseases. She'll know how to handle this confidentially." "Dot, please," Bill started. "The discussion is over," she said, dialing the hospital's direct line. "We're getting you help, and we're getting it now. Michael, go pack a bag for your father. Include his medications, his insurance cards, and anything else he might need for an extended hospital stay." As the phone rang, Dot looked at her husband slumped in his kitchen chair, 47 wounds marking his flesh like stigmata of paternal love. And whatever came next, scandal, financial ruin, family disgrace, they would face it together. Because that's what families did. They bore each other's burdens, shared each other's pain, and refused to let go even when holding on seemed impossible. "Dr. Patterson's office," came the crisp voice through the receiver. "This is Dorothy Harrison," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I need to speak with Dr. Patterson immediately. It's a medical emergency involving my family." Thanksgiving evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the Harrison family dinner feel surreal, as if nature itself was conspiring against their attempt at normalcy. Dorothy had insisted on cooking despite everything. The 20-pound turkey that Bill had always carved, the cornbread stuffing recipe that had been in her family for 3 generations, the sweet potato casserole that Michael had loved since childhood. But as they sat around the dining room table that had witnessed 47 years of family celebrations, the empty spaces spoke louder than any conversation. Dr. Emily Patterson had agreed to delay hospital admission until after the holiday, a professional kindness that Dot suspected had more to do with the doctor's own family commitments than medical protocol. 24 hours won't make a significant difference, Dr. Patterson had assured her during their phone consultation. But monitor his temperature closely, and if he spikes above 104 or loses consciousness, call 911 immediately. Bill sat at the head of the table in his best flannel shirt, the one Dot had carefully selected to hide the bandages covering his back. She'd spent an hour that morning applying fresh dressings to each of the 47 wounds, her nursing training warring with her heart as she documented the progression of infection. The larvae were more active now, visible movement beneath his skin that made her stomach churn with professional horror and maternal anguish. Michael picked at his mashed potatoes with mechanical precision, barely touching the feast that had once been his favorite meal of the year. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and crushing guilt that no amount of parental forgiveness seemed able to ease. He'd tried to leave town 3 times since confessing the truth, and 3 times Dot had found him packing his duffel bag with that same defeated expression she'd seen on trauma patients who'd given up hope. "Pass the gravy, son," Bill said, his voice carrying forced cheer that fooled no one. The simple act of reaching across the table caused him to wince visibly, and Dot saw sweat beading on his forehead despite the mild temperature. "Dad, you shouldn't be—" Michael started. "I shouldn't be having Thanksgiving dinner with my family," Bill interrupted, managing a weak smile. "Son, I've had worse meals in foxholes. This is paradise." The normalcy felt obscene. Here they sat, discussing football scores and community gossip while parasitic larvae grew beneath her husband's skin like some biblical plague. Dot found herself watching Bill's every movement, cataloging symptoms with the detached precision she'd learned in the ICU. Elevated heart rate, labored breathing, slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there a week ago. The call came at 7:42 p.m. just as Dot was serving pumpkin pie. The shrill ring of the kitchen phone cut through their forced conversation like a scream, and all 3 family members froze. Michael was closest to the phone, but he made no move to answer it. "I'll get it," Dot said, grateful for any excuse to leave the table and the pretense that everything was normal. "Mrs. Harrison?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Dr. Rodriguez from Cedar Falls Memorial Emergency Department. We have a situation that requires Dr. Patterson's immediate attention, but she's not answering her pager. Do you know how we can reach her?" Dot's blood turned to ice. "What kind of situation?" "We have 3 patients presenting with parasitic infections similar to what Dr. Patterson described in her consultation notes about your husband's case. 2 are veterans, 1 recently returned from overseas deployment, Mrs. Harrison. If these cases are related, we may be looking at a communicable infection." The phone slipped from Dot's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the kitchen wall before swinging on its cord. She could hear Dr. Rodriguez's voice calling her name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. Through the dining room doorway, she could see Bill and Michael still sitting at the table, unaware that their private family crisis had just become something much larger and more terrifying. "Mom?" Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, alarm written across his face. "What's wrong?" Dot retrieved the phone with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Dr. Rodriguez, this is Dorothy Harrison. I need you to repeat what you just told me." 3 patients, all veterans, all presenting with circular parasitic lesions consistent with your husband's condition. "Mrs. Harrison, we need to speak with your family immediately. There may be an outbreak." The word outbreak hit Dot like a physical blow. In her 40 years of nursing, she'd seen infectious diseases spread through communities, watched as single cases became epidemics that overwhelmed medical resources and destroyed families. The thought that her husband's condition might be spreading to other veterans, other families, was more than she could process. "We'll be right there," she managed to say, then hung up before Dr. Rodriguez could ask more questions she couldn't answer. "Dot?" Bill's voice came from the dining room, weaker than it had been an hour ago. "Everything all right?" She walked back to the table on unsteady legs, looking at her husband and son with new eyes. If this was an outbreak, if other veterans were infected, then everything they thought they knew about the situation was wrong. Bill's experimental transfer therapy wasn't an isolated act of parental sacrifice. It was potentially the first domino in a medical catastrophe. "We need to go to the hospital," she said quietly. "Now." "What happened?" Michael stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. "Who was on the phone?" "There are other cases," Dot said, her nursing training taking over as shock gave way to professional urgency. "3 more veterans with the same symptoms as your father. The hospital thinks we may be dealing with a communicable infection." Bill's face went ashen. "That's impossible. The transfer procedure was contained, sterile." "Apparently not sterile enough," Dot snapped, then immediately regretted her harsh tone. But fear was replacing her earlier anger. Fear for her husband and son and all the other families who might be facing the same nightmare. "Michael, how many people have you been in contact with since you returned from deployment?" "I don't know. Dozens, maybe." "Why?" Then understanding dawned in his eyes like a terrible sunrise. "Oh, God." "You think I infected other people before Dad started the transfer therapy?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Dot admitted. "But we're going to find out. Both of you get in the car, now." The drive to Cedar Falls Memorial took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Bill slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow and rapid, while Michael sat in the back making phone calls to Army buddies he'd spent time with since returning home. Each call ended the same way. Worried questions about whether Michael was all right, whether he needed anything, whether they should be concerned about their own health. "Tommy Rodriguez says he's been having back pain for a week," Michael reported after his 5th call. "And Jake Morrison mentioned some kind of rash that won't go away." Dot gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white against the black plastic. "How many people, Michael?" "How many veterans have you been around since you got back?" "The whole VFW post," Michael said miserably. "We had a welcome home barbecue when I got back. Maybe 30 guys showed up, all different eras. Vietnam vets, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan." 30 veterans, Dot repeated, her mind calculating the potential scope of disaster. "All in one location, sharing food and drinks and close contact." Bill turned to look at his son, his face gray with pain and something deeper. The realization that his attempt to protect Michael might have inadvertently put dozens of other families at risk. "Son, this isn't your fault." "Isn't it?" Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "I brought this home from Afghanistan. I infected you when you tried to help me, and now it's spreading to people who had nothing to do with any of this." Cedar Falls Memorial loomed ahead of them, its emergency department lit up like a beacon in the growing darkness. As Dot pulled into the parking lot, she could see ambulances lined up at the entrance, more than she'd ever seen outside of major disasters. Through the glass doors, she caught glimpses of medical staff moving with the controlled urgency that meant multiple critical cases. "Dear God," she whispered, watching a stretcher being wheeled through the entrance. "What have we done?" Bill reached over and took her hand, his skin burning with fever but his grip still strong. "We tried to protect our son," he said simply. "That's what parents do. Whatever comes next, we face it together." But as they sat in the hospital parking lot watching ambulance after ambulance arrive, Dot couldn't shake the feeling that their private family tragedy was about to become something much bigger and much more devastating than any of them had imagined. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, other families were discovering the same horrific truth the Harrisons had faced that morning. Other wives were looking at mysterious wounds on their husbands' backs. Other children were confronting the reality that their parents' love might not be enough to save them. The Harrison family crisis had become a community disaster, and Thanksgiving 2023 would be remembered not for gratitude and family gatherings, but as the night when everything changed. The emergency department of Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital had been transformed into something Dorothy Harrison barely recognized. In her 40 years of nursing, she'd never seen the familiar corridors so chaotic, filled with the controlled urgency that came with mass casualty events. Stretchers lined the hallways, each carrying a veteran whose back bore the same horrific circular wounds that had been eating away at her husband for weeks. "Mrs. Harrison!" Dr. Emily Patterson appeared through the crowd, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her lab coat stained with the evidence of a medical crisis spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Thank God you're here. We need information about your husband's condition, and we need it now." Dot helped Bill from the wheelchair a nurse had insisted he use, watching as her husband struggled to maintain dignity while his body betrayed him with each labored breath. Around them, the sounds of suffering filled the air, veterans of different wars, different decades, all united by the mysterious infection that had somehow spread through their close-knit community. "How many?" Dot asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. 17 confirmed cases so far," Dr. Patterson replied grimly. "All veterans, all presenting with identical parasitic lesions. 2 are in critical condition, 3 others showing signs of systemic infection. Mrs. Harrison, we need to understand how this started." Michael stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "It started with me," he said, his voice carrying across the emergency department with the clarity of a confession. "I brought this back from Afghanistan, and it's spread to everyone I've been in contact with." Dr. Patterson's expression shifted from professional concern to something deeper, a mixture of compassion and alarm that made Dot's stomach clench with dread. "Son, parasitic infections don't typically spread through casual contact. There has to be another vector." "The VFW barbecue," Michael said miserably. 3 weeks ago, we shared food, drinks, told war stories. I thought I was being careful, but I must have—" "You must have what?" Dr. Patterson pressed gently. "I was still symptomatic then," Michael admitted. "The larvae were active and I was treating the wounds myself. I probably contaminated surfaces, utensils, maybe even the air in the meeting hall." The revelation hung in the emergency department air like a toxic cloud. Dot watched as Dr. Patterson processed the implications. 17 sick veterans was just the beginning. Anyone who had attended that barbecue, anyone who had been in contact with those veterans afterward could potentially be infected. "We need to contact the CDC," Dr. Patterson said, reaching for her phone. "This is beyond anything our facility can handle alone." "No!" Bill's voice cut through the chaos with surprising strength. "You can't turn this into some federal investigation. These men served their country. They don't deserve to be treated like lab rats." "Mr. Harrison, with respect, this infection could spread beyond the veteran community," Dr. Patterson replied. "We have wives, children, grandchildren at risk. I have to report this." That's when the screaming started. It came from examination room 3, a sound that made every person in the emergency department freeze with primal recognition of agony. Through the partially open door, Dot caught a glimpse of Tommy Rodriguez, a Gulf War veteran she'd known since he was Michael's age. He was convulsing on the examination table while medical staff struggled to hold him down. "He's seizing!" a nurse called out. "Dr. Patterson, we need you now." As Dr. Patterson rushed toward the crisis, Dot found herself moving on autopilot, 40 years of medical training overriding personal anguish. She pushed through the crowd of family members and medical staff, arriving at Tommy's bedside just as his back arched in a spasm that looked almost inhuman. "His core temperature is 106, the attending nurse reported. Blood pressure dropping, pulse erratic." Dot looked at Tommy's exposed back and nearly vomited. The circular wounds that had seemed manageable on her husband were massive on the younger veteran, some as large as silver dollars, each one actively moving with larvae that appeared to be emerging simultaneously. "They're all coming out at once," Dr. Patterson whispered, her professional composure cracking for the first time. "This isn't how parasitic life cycles work." Something has triggered mass emergence. What does that mean? Michael had appeared beside Dot, his face white with horror as he stared at what his infection had become in Tommy's body. It means his immune system is failing, Dot said quietly, her nursing knowledge filling in the terrible gaps. The parasites are killing him. Tommy's wife Maria rushed into the room, took one look at her husband's condition, and collapsed. The sound of her hitting the floor was like a gunshot in the confined space. And suddenly everyone was moving, nurses attending to Maria, doctors working frantically over Tommy, family members screaming for information no one could provide. In the chaos, Dot felt Bill's hand slip into hers. When she looked at her husband, she saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. If this was what the infection could become, if this was Tommy's fate after just 3 weeks of symptoms, then Bill's condition was far more serious than any of them had realized. "Dorothy," Bill whispered, his voice barely audible over the medical emergency unfolding around them. "I need to tell you something." "Not now, William." "Now!" he insisted, with the same quiet authority he'd used to command respect for 47 years. "While I still can." Dr. Patterson was shouting orders for emergency surgery, calling for the hospital's most experienced surgeon, demanding blood work and IV antibiotics and equipment that Cedar Falls Memorial might not even have. But Dot found herself focusing entirely on her husband's words, understanding instinctively that this might be their last private conversation. "I knew the risks when I started the transfer procedure," Bill said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I researched everything, talked to doctors, even contacted that Dr. Hendricks from the Vietnam studies. He warned me that the parasites might be more aggressive in older hosts." "You knew this could happen," Dot said, not a question but a statement of devastating realization. "I knew, and I did it anyway," Bill confirmed, "because watching our son suffer was killing me just as surely as these creatures are killing me now. At least this way, Michael has a chance at a normal life." "A normal life?" Dot gestured toward the chaos surrounding Tommy Rodriguez's medical crisis. "Look around you, William. This isn't normal. This is a disaster that's destroying families throughout our community." "That's not Michael's fault," Bill said firmly. "He came home sick from serving his country. What happened after that? The spread, the outbreak. That's on me. I made the choice to intervene and I accept the consequences." Tommy Rodriguez flatlined at 9:47 p.m. The sound of the cardiac monitor's steady tone cut through every other noise in the emergency department, creating a moment of absolute silence that felt like a prayer. Dr. Patterson and her team worked for another 20 minutes, trying every resuscitation protocol in their training, but Tommy was gone. Maria Rodriguez's wails filled the hospital corridor, a sound of grief so raw and primal that it seemed to echo off the walls like a curse. She was 34 years old, mother of 2 young children, and now a widow because of a barbecue intended to welcome home returning veterans. "He's the first," Dr. Patterson said quietly, appearing at Dot's side with exhaustion written across her face. "But if we don't find a treatment protocol soon, he won't be the last." Dot looked at her husband, seeing Tommy Rodriguez's fate written in Bill's fevered features and labored breathing. Around them, 17 families were learning the same terrible truth the Harrisons had discovered that morning, that love and sacrifice weren't always enough to overcome the brutal realities of biology and medicine. "How long do they have?" Dot asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Dr. Patterson's silence was answer enough. In the distance, they could hear more ambulances arriving, their sirens adding to the symphony of medical crisis that had overtaken their quiet Iowa community. Thanksgiving night 2023 was becoming the deadliest evening in Cedar Falls history, and it was only the beginning. The Harrison family's private tragedy had become a community disaster, and Tommy Rodriguez was just the first casualty in what promised to be a very long and terrible night. The moment came at 11:43 p.m. in the sterile quiet of Examination Room 7, when everything Dorothy Harrison thought she knew about her family shattered like glass against stone. Dr. Emily Patterson had just finished examining Bill's wounds under surgical lighting, her latex gloves stained with evidence of an infection that defied every protocol in her medical training. The expression on the doctor's face told Dot everything she needed to know about her husband's prognosis, but it was what Dr. Patterson said next that stopped her heart entirely. "Mrs. Harrison," Dr. Patterson began carefully, "I need to ask you about your family history, specifically about any children you may have had who were given up for adoption." The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. Dot felt Michael's sharp intake of breath beside her, saw Bill's eyes widen with recognition despite his fever-induced delirium. After 43 years of carefully buried secrets, the truth was clawing its way to the surface. "Why would you ask that?" Dot whispered, though her hands had already begun to tremble with the terrible certainty of what was coming. Dr. Patterson removed her surgical gloves with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, then reached into her lab coat pocket. What she withdrew was a small, faded photograph, the kind taken in hospital nurseries in 1980, with that distinctive blue-tinted quality of old Polaroid film. The image showed a tiny infant with wisps of dark hair and eyes that Dot recognized with stunning clarity. "Because," Dr. Patterson said quietly, "I believe I'm your daughter." The words hit Dot like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending her stumbling backward against the examination room wall. The photograph fluttered to the floor between them, but she didn't need to see it again. She had carried that same image in her wallet for 43 years, a secret reminder of the child she'd been forced to give away. "Emily?" Dot breathed, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. "My little butterfly." Dr. Patterson's professional composure cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, confirming what Dot's heart had already accepted. "You used to call me that when I was in the NICU. The nurses told my adoptive parents about it, said my birth mother sang to me every day for 3 weeks. Bill struggled to sit up on the examination table, his face a battlefield between physical agony and emotional overwhelm. "Emily Rose Patterson," he said, his voice cracking with wonder. "Born March 15, 1980 at 11:47 p.m. 2 pounds, 14 ounces, the most beautiful thing we'd ever seen." "Dad?" Michael's voice was small, confused, the voice of a man discovering that his family history contained chapters he'd never been allowed to read. "Your sister," Bill managed to say, reaching toward Dr. Patterson with hands that shook from more than fever. "The daughter we gave away because we couldn't afford to keep her." The reunion played out against the backdrop of medical crisis. 43 years of separation dissolved in a moment of recognition that transcended all the pain and chaos surrounding them. Dr. Patterson, Emily, stepped forward hesitantly, as if approaching a mirage that might disappear at any moment. "I've been searching for you my whole life," she said, her voice breaking. "When I saw the Harrison name on your husband's chart, I thought it might be coincidence. But when I examined his wounds, when I saw the care someone with medical knowledge had been providing—" "You knew it was us," Dot finished, understanding flooding through her like warm water. "That's why you agreed to the house call. That's why you've been handling this case personally." Emily nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I became a doctor because I wanted to save people the way I wished someone could have saved my birth family from whatever circumstances made you give me up. I specialized in infectious diseases because I hoped someday I might encounter a case that would lead me back to you." "We never wanted to give you up," Bill said, his words slurred but heartfelt. "Your mother had complications, spent 3 months in the hospital. The bills were—" We lost everything. Our house, our savings, my job at the railroad. Keeping you would have meant all of us living on the street. We chose a family that could give you everything we couldn't, Dot added, her voice thick with 43 years of suppressed grief. College-educated, financially stable, desperate for a child. We thought we were giving you a better life. Michael stepped forward, his own emotions clearly overwhelming. I have a sister, he said wonderingly. All these years I've had a sister. And I've had a brother, Emily replied, looking at Michael with eyes that held the same genetic markers as their father's. I've had a whole family, and I never knew it. But even as the miraculous reunion unfolded, the harsh realities of the medical crisis couldn't be ignored. Bill's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing had become shallow and labored, his skin burning with fever that wouldn't respond to conventional treatment. The parasitic infection that had brought them together was still threatening to tear them apart. Dad's dying, isn't he? Michael asked, the question no one else had been willing to voice. Emily's professional training warred with her newfound maternal emotions as she looked at the man she now knew was her father. The infection is more advanced than anything I've seen in the literature. The parasites have reached his bloodstream, and his immune system is beginning to fail. How long? Dot asked, her nursing background demanding clinical honesty even as her heart begged for false hope. Hours, maybe less, Emily admitted. The same pattern we saw with Mr. Rodriguez is beginning in your husband's case. Mass emergence of larvae, system-wide inflammation, cascading organ failure. The examination room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Bill's monitors and the distant sounds of continued medical emergencies throughout the hospital. 17 other families were facing similar conversations. 17 other wives were learning that their husbands might not survive the night. There has to be something, Michael said desperately. Some treatment, some procedure. There is one possibility, Emily said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that could either save or damn them all. It's experimental, dangerous, and I've never attempted it on a human patient. What kind of procedure? Dot asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Surgical removal of all active larvae, followed by aggressive antiparasitic therapy and immune system support, Emily explained. The success rate in animal trials was roughly 30%, and the complications were significant. 30%, Bill repeated, his fever-bright eyes focusing on his newly discovered daughter. Better odds than I had in Vietnam. Dad, you're not thinking clearly, Michael protested. Experimental surgery in your condition is the only chance we have, Bill interrupted with surprising firmness. And it's not just about me anymore. If Emily can perfect the procedure on me, she might be able to save the other veterans. Tommy Rodriguez died because we didn't know enough. Maybe his death can mean something if it helps the others. Dot looked at her husband, this man who had spent their entire marriage putting others before himself, who had literally taken his son's infection onto his own body, who was now volunteering to be a medical guinea pig to save his fellow veterans. The depth of his sacrifice was both inspiring and heartbreaking. I can't ask you to do this, Emily said, her voice trembling. I just found you again. I can't risk losing you so soon. Little butterfly, Bill said, using the nickname that had bridged 43 years of separation. Sometimes the people we love most are worth the biggest risks. Outside the examination room, Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital continued its transformation into a battlefield against an enemy no one fully understood. 17 families held vigil over loved ones whose bodies had become hosts to creatures that shouldn't exist in modern medicine. The CDC had been contacted, federal investigators were en route, and media vans were already gathering in the hospital parking lot. But in Examination Room 7, a family that had been torn apart by poverty and desperation 4 decades earlier was choosing to face an uncertain future together. 3 generations of Harrisons, plus one doctor who had spent her entire life searching for home, prepared to make decisions that would echo through the rest of their lives. "We do the surgery," Dot said finally, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 40 years making life-and-death decisions. "We do it tonight, and we do it together." Emily nodded, her tears mixing with professional determination. "Then let's save some lives." The surgery began at 2:17 a.m. on November 25, 2023, in Operating Room 3 of Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital. Dorothy Harrison stood in the observation gallery, her hands pressed against the glass as she watched her daughter prepare to operate on the husband she'd just met after 43 years of separation. Below them, William Harrison lay unconscious on the operating table, his back exposed under harsh surgical lights that revealed the full horror of what love had driven him to endure. 47 wounds dotted his skin like a constellation of sacrifice, each one containing parasitic larvae that had grown beyond anything in medical literature. Dr. Emily Patterson moved with the precision of someone who had trained her entire life for this moment, though Dot suspected her daughter had never imagined the patient would be her own father. "First incision." Emily's voice came through the intercom system, steady despite the tears Dot could see glistening in her eyes. "Beginning extraction of larva number 1. Michael stood beside his mother in the gallery, his face a mask of barely controlled anguish. He'd tried to leave twice, claiming he couldn't watch his father suffer for his mistakes, but Dot had refused to let him go. "Your father is fighting for all of us," she'd told him firmly. "The least we can do is fight alongside him." The procedure was unlike anything Dot had witnessed in 40 years of nursing. Each larva had to be carefully extracted with surgical precision, the wounds thoroughly cleaned and treated to prevent secondary infection. Emily worked methodically, her training evident in every movement, but Dot could see the emotional toll in the slight tremor of her daughter's hands. "Larva number 12 successfully removed," Emily reported. "Wound appears clean, minimal tissue damage. Patient's vitals remain stable." Through the observation window, Dot watched as Emily placed each extracted parasite into a specimen container, building a collection that would likely advance parasitic medicine by decades. The irony wasn't lost on her. Bill's sacrifice was creating medical knowledge that could save countless future victims. "Mom," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What if he doesn't make it?" "Then he dies knowing he saved his son and his community," Dot replied, though her own heart was breaking with each passing minute. "Your father has never done anything halfway, Michael. If this is his final battle, he'll fight it with everything he has." At 3:45 a.m., complications arose. "His blood pressure is dropping," the anesthesiologist announced, heart rate becoming irregular. Emily paused in her work. 23 larvae successfully removed, 24 still remaining. Through the intercom, Dot could hear the controlled urgency in her daughter's voice as she consulted with the surgical team. "We can stop here," Emily said, looking up toward the observation gallery. "We've removed nearly half the parasites. That might be enough to stabilize his condition." "No," came Bill's weak but unmistakable voice through the surgical speakers. "All of them. Every last one." The operating room fell silent. Patients weren't supposed to be conscious during this type of procedure, but Bill's voice carried the clarity of a man who had made his final decision. "Dad, you need to rest," Michael called through the intercom. "Let them finish the surgery properly." "I am resting, son," Bill replied, his words slurred but determined. "Resting in the knowledge that what we're doing here tonight will save lives. Emily, my little butterfly, keep going." Emily looked up at the observation gallery one more time, seeking approval from the family she'd just found. Dot pressed her hand against the glass and nodded, giving her daughter permission to continue fighting for her father's life. The next 3 hours stretched like years. Emily worked with a focus that reminded Dot of herself during her most challenging nursing shifts. Completely absorbed in the task, every ounce of training and instinct focused on saving the patient. One by one, the remaining larvae were extracted, each removal bringing them closer to success or catastrophe. "Final larva," Emily announced at 6:52 a.m. as dawn light began filtering through the hospital windows. "Extraction complete. Beginning wound closure." Dot felt her knees buckle with relief, but Michael caught her arm, steadying her as they watched Emily begin the delicate work of suturing 47 surgical sites. Bill's vital signs had remained stable throughout the final hour, suggesting that his body was responding positively to the removal of the parasitic burden. "He's going to make it," Michael whispered, wonder creeping into his voice. "Dad's actually going to make it." But their celebration was premature. At 7:15 a.m., as Emily was completing the final sutures, Bill's heart stopped. The monitors erupted in alarms, filling the operating room with the steady tone that every medical professional dreaded. Emily immediately began CPR, her hands working rhythmically on her father's chest while the surgical team scrambled to prepare defibrillation equipment. "Come on, Dad!" Michael pressed against the observation glass, his voice breaking. "You've come this far, don't give up now." Dot found herself praying for the first time in years, her lips moving silently as she watched her daughter fight to save her husband's life. Emily worked with desperate efficiency, alternating between chest compressions and checking for any sign of cardiac activity. "Charging to 200 joules, the nurse announced. "Clear!" Bill's body convulsed as electricity coursed through him, but the monitor remained flat. Emily resumed compressions, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool operating room temperature. "Again!" she commanded. "Charging to 300 joules. The second shock produced a weak blip on the monitor, then nothing. Emily continued CPR, her movements becoming more desperate with each passing minute. Hospital protocol called for terminating resuscitation efforts after 30 minutes, but nobody in the operating room seemed willing to give up on the man who had sacrificed so much for others. "Emily," Dot said softly through the intercom. "Sweetheart, you've done everything you could." "No," Emily replied fiercely, never stopping her compressions. "I didn't find my father after 43 years just to lose him on my operating table. He's going to live. He has to live." At 7:41 a.m., 26 minutes after his heart had stopped, William Harrison drew a shuddering breath. The monitors erupted in a symphony of electronic celebration as his heart rhythm returned, weak but steady. Emily stepped back from the table, her surgical gown soaked with perspiration, tears streaming down her face as she watched her father's chest rise and fall with independent breathing. "He's back," she whispered, her voice carrying through the intercom like a prayer answered. "He's alive." In the observation gallery, Dot collapsed into Michael's arms, 47 years of marriage and 8 hours of terror finally giving way to overwhelming relief. Their family, expanded by the miraculous return of a daughter they thought they'd lost forever, had survived the night that had claimed too many others. "What happens now?" Michael asked as they watched Emily and her team prepare Bill for transport to the intensive care unit. "Now we heal," Dot replied, her hand pressed against the glass that separated her from her husband and daughter. "All of us. Together." Emily looked up from the operating table one final time, catching her mother's eyes through the observation window. In that moment, 43 years of separation dissolved completely. They were a family again, scarred, exhausted, but whole. "The other patients," Emily said through the intercom. "I can save them now. The procedure works. Dad proved it works." Throughout the rest of that morning, as Cedar Falls woke to news of the miraculous surgery that had saved William Harrison's life, Emily Patterson worked tirelessly to replicate the procedure on the remaining veterans. 16 men went into surgery that day, and 16 men came out alive. Tommy Rodriguez's death had not been in vain. It had taught them what not to do, paving the way for the life-saving protocol that Emily developed. By noon on November 25th, the parasitic outbreak that had threatened to devastate the veteran community of Cedar Falls had been contained and treated. The CDC investigators arrived to find a medical miracle. A small-town hospital had developed a cure for a condition that had never been successfully treated before. But for the Harrison family, the real miracle wasn't medical. It was the discovery that love, sacrifice, and stubborn determination could overcome even the most impossible odds. William Harrison had risked everything to save his son, and in doing so, had brought home the daughter they thought they'd lost forever. As Bill was wheeled into the intensive care unit, still unconscious but breathing steadily, Dot took Emily's hand for the first time in 43 years. "Welcome home, little butterfly," she whispered. "I've been waiting my whole life to hear you say that," Emily replied, squeezing her mother's hand as they walked together toward their family's future. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the strongest families. William Harrison's story reminds us that a parent's love knows no boundaries, not age, not pain, not even the fear of death itself. When his son Michael returned from Afghanistan carrying more than just memories of war, Bill made a choice that defined what it truly means to be a father. He took his child's burden onto his own body, literally carrying the infection that threatened Michael's future. For 47 wounds across his back, Bill endured months of agony and silence, protecting not just his son, but his wife Dorothy from the terrible truth. Yet sometimes, our greatest sacrifices lead to unexpected blessings. Through Bill's desperate act of love, the Harrison family was reunited with Emily, the daughter they'd given up for adoption 43 years earlier, now the very doctor who could save them all. This Thanksgiving story proves that family bonds can survive any separation, heal any wound, and overcome any obstacle when love leads the way. In our golden years, we understand that legacy isn't about what we accumulate, but what we're willing to sacrifice for those we love most. What sacrifice have you made for your family that you're most proud of? Have you ever discovered that a painful decision led to an unexpected blessing? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how love has shaped your family's journey.